Hi everybody, and welcome to Big Joe's Journal. My name is Joe Tilden, and I am the host of this program. Well, 24 candidates seeking to be the Democratic nominee, and we're going to start breaking that down next week. I believe it's NBC that is going to host the first two debates. Now you say, well, how do you get 24 people in a debate? Well, actually, it's not really a debate. It's more of a question and answer session, and they're going to do it in two sections. 12 on the 26th of June and 12 on the 27th. And I believe they did it by drawing lots. And the way it worked out, I believe Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders are going to be on the 27th. Well, as you look at 24 candidates running for nomination, of course, over a period of time, this field will whittle on down. And the way it's usually based on your funding, how much money you can raise. People are going to look at the candidates and they're going to say, well, who has the best chance of winning? And that's going to eliminate a lot of people. But, as I look at it from here, I think when you get down to the final go-around, it's going to be Joe Biden, definitely, former vice president. Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren. I think probably the junior senator from New Jersey, Cory Booker, the junior senator from California, Kamala Harris. I think the former congressman from Texas, Beto O'Rourke, and a long shot, I think, would be probably be the mayor of South Bend, Indiana. And I think it's because it's a novelty. I think that's what's keeping him in the race. He's young, but I think it's novelty. He's gay, and his so-called husband, I mean, if he should be elected, would be what, the first gentleman? Well, somehow or another, I have trouble with a man having a husband. Man has a wife, but, time is passing me by. And you kind of got to look at what's acceptable today and roll with it. But as I look at the overall picture, and we've still got a ways to go, I think Sanders and Warren are going to eliminate each other. And I think it's going to come down to a contest between Joe Biden and Cory Booker. I think they'll be your two finalists. And you can put together a strong ticket, say of Joe Biden and former Congressman O'Rourke from Texas would be a very, very strong ticket. Excuse me, very, very active ticket. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris from California would also be a strong ticket. She's African American, she's female. That would draw an awful lot of votes, As I said, Biden and O'Rourke. Senator Booker and O'Rourke, I think would be a strong ticket. Senator Booker and Harris, no, I don't think that would work. But it's a long ways to go, and the political showmanship is starting. On the Republican side, the ridiculous buffoon, who is the incumbent, is going to be announcing his candidacy. The day I'm taping the show, it'll be tomorrow, although when you're watching the show, that'll be the day that he's announced. As usual, he can't refrain from telling a lie and then trying to back off from it, but you can't trust him. So far, the only Republican that's got enough backbone to challenge him, and that is the former governor of Massachusetts. But you know the old saying, he's got about as much chance of being the Republican nominee as a snowball in hell. So most of the attention is going to be on what's going on with the Democratic Party. And they'll have these debates early, and I think even before you get into the first rounds in Iowa, I think that field of 24 will probably be whittled down to maybe, I would say, 16 to 18. And it will gradually whittle down as people drop out. Well, another election that caused a bit of controversy occurred back in 1912. In 1908, Theodore Roosevelt was finishing 7 years as president. He had succeeded William McKinley, who had been assassinated, served 3 years of McKinley's term, excuse me, and was elected on his own in 1904. Well, even though there was no statute or no written regulation, by tradition, if a president had served more than the term of his predecessor and then a term of his own, he did not seek re-election. And so it was with Theodore Roosevelt as he stepped down from the presidency. But he handpicked his successor, who was William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft was the governor of Ohio. And Franklin Roosevelt figured, well, he will be the president, but I will be the power behind the throne. Well, after Roosevelt left office, he took a trip. I believe he went on a safari to Africa, and then he took another trip to South America. Many of Theodore Roosevelt's policies, I think Bernie Sanders would have adopted today, particularly his policy on trust busting. These big conglomerates that had come together in the 1890s, especially big oil, your big railroads. Roosevelt pushed, excuse me again, Roosevelt pushed through legislation which pretty well made them break up. He also advocated a strong naval presence for the United States. He had the motto, speak softly but carry a big stick. And as a result of that, you're going to have to excuse me a little bit here. As a result of that, he sent the U.S. Navy on a world cruise, mainly to demonstrate our naval power. Great Britain at that time still claimed to be the mistress of the seas. But I think Roosevelt wanted to let them know that she might be a mistress, but there was another one not too far behind. But it was a display of American military might. Well, William Howard Taft, of course, coming from Ohio, he undid much of what Roosevelt had done in regarding to business conglomerates. And when Roosevelt returned after his safari and trips through South America, and he'd seen what his successor had done, he became very angry. And this friendship between Roosevelt and Taft came to an end. The result was in 1912, excuse me, Roosevelt wanted Taft to step down. And, of course, Taft would not. So in the convention that year, the Republicans renominated Taft. And Roosevelt became so infuriated that he voted the Republican Party, and he started a party of his own called the Bull Moose Party. Roosevelt, as you know, was a great hunter and a great conservationist. He was responsible for getting our national park system going and getting it started, especially out at Yellowstone, Yosemite, and then, of course, other national parks were created, came on board. Incidentally, 2018 was the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service, which became a government agency under, ironically, Woodrow Wilson. Well, the result was, with a split Republican Party, the Democrats nominated a man originally from Virginia, but at the time of his nomination was the president of Princeton University in New Jersey. That was Woodrow Wilson. And with a split Republican Party, Wilson was elected, become our 28th president. Theodore Roosevelt, with the Bull Moose Party, came in second, and Mr. Taft, the Republican candidate, came in third. Well, the irony of the whole thing is that in 1915, with the death of Charles Evans Hughes as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Woodrow Wilson turned around and appointed William Howard Taft to be the Chief Justice. So William Howard Taft is the only man that has served as both President of the United States and Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Well, under Woodrow Wilson, his big thing was to try and restore some semblancy, after Roosevelt deregulating big business and Taft restoring big business, to try to bring some sort of balance back to the country. But matters would sort of be taken out of his hand. In 1914 in Sarajevo, the Austrian Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated. And this would trigger World War I, at that time called the Great War. Europe had been developing a number of alliances all through the 1800s, especially after the French Revolution. And where you had many city-states, especially in Italy and Germany, and places like that, there was a move on to create nations, nationalism. In Italy, Garibaldi united a number of Italian cities under the direction of Rome, created the nation of Italy. And the ruler of Rome, who was the king at that time, became the king of Italy. In Germany, Otto von Bismarck from Prussia. Prussia was probably the most militant state in that part of Europe at the time. Prussia attacked and overcame a number of other states and created what we now know as Germany. And of course, with the creation of Germany, Otto von Bismarck had himself installed as the prime minister and the virtual ruler of Germany. And the king of Prussia, known as the Kaiser, became the king of Germany. Although he didn't have the title of king, he was he's called the Kaiser, meaning top dog. Ironically, the royalty of Great Britain, beginning with George I, way back before the American Revolution, came from Germany. The state of Hanover is where the current English family came from. And it was in World War I that King George V dropped their German name and adopted the name of Windsor. So we know the royal family today by the family name of Windsor, and not their German name, which in the senior moment right now I just can't recall. But in 1914, the assassination of the Duke Ferdinand of Austria, the Archduke he was the successor to the Austrian-Hungarian throne. Austria and Hungary were one nation at that time. And this set off all sorts of repercussions. As Europe divided into nations, it also divided into military alliances. Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia was in on that alliance for a short time, then they withdrew. On the other side of the fence, the new nation of Italy, getting a little fearful of Germany, formed an alliance with France, and France and Great Britain, which had been enemies for years, became partners in an alliance. Holland allied itself with Germany. Belgium allied itself with France. Belgium was a fairly new country in Europe. It was created mainly by people known as the Flemish, and they spoke pretty much German. And another section of Belgium, of course, their mother tongue was French. But they formed the nation of Belgium. Also at that time, many of these European countries were looking to create influence outside of Europe. And so you had an era of European colonization in other continents, primarily Africa, Southeast Asia. Here in the New World, Great Britain had a number of colonies. The most famous, of course, is our good neighbor to the north, Canada. They also had Bermuda off the coast of the U.S. and a number of islands in the Caribbean. They also had in Central America, a country that was known as British Honduras. It's now known as Belize, B-E-L-I-Z-E, Belize, I believe. In South America, they had British Guiana. France also maintained some of their colonies here in the Western Hemisphere. They had a few islands in the Caribbean. They also had a section in South America, which was known as French Guiana. And Holland, not to be outdone, also had a section of South America, Dutch Guiana. Holland's probably largest colonial undertaking was what we call the East Indies. And is now known as Indonesia. But Holland used military and naval force and established them as their Asian colony, and also an island off the coast of China. Britain had already established a colony off the coast of China called Hong Kong, which they would cede to China, I believe, in the 50s, the 1950s. Colonization spread, especially, as I said, in Africa. There was French influence in particularly North Africa, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco. Very, very strong. Not only a strong French influence, but it was more or less where France organized I don't know if you'd call them a paramilitary organization, but the famous French Foreign Legion, where anybody from any country could join, but the officers were all French. And a lot of Americans, you know, when the Depression came on and economic conditions were hard, and they had a spirit of adventure, they went to North Africa and joined the French Foreign Legion. Well, France established a very strong influence in northern Africa. Great Britain, on the other hand, strong influence in Egypt. And Holland had gone and conquered South Africa and what is now known as Rhodesia. Well, England and Holland had a little war, which England won, and Great Britain took over South Africa and Rhodesia. Portugal, not to be outdone, conquered Angola. Belgium wanted a hand in the card game, and their colony that they took over and occupied was known as the Belgian Congo. It's now known as the Republic of the Congo. And Germany had a hand in Africa, down on the southwest coast of Africa. So Europe trying to gain influence, very, very strong influence. And tensions are rising in Europe. Things are getting close to the breaking point. In 1870, Germany and France went to war. Germany won. Bismarck was just trying to show off that he'd built a nation and that it was no longer going to be subservient to the wishes of France and Great Britain. A country that became real concerned with the growth of Germany was Poland. And they were also concerned with the growth of Russia. Poland aligned itself with Great Britain and France and Italy. Spain tried to stay neutral. Portugal attempted to stay neutral. But things are lining up. Well, 1914, here you have the assassination. And Austria and Germany, they're going to go to war with what, Sarajevo, it was part of Yugoslavia, which doesn't exist anymore. Yugoslavia saw themselves overwhelmed. And so they cried for help because of this treaty that they also had, and they'd aligned with France and Great Britain. So France declares war on Germany, and Germany does the same thing. Well, with their allies in, and Poland being frightened by Germany, Poland appealed to Great Britain. So Great Britain joins France, alliance with Poland, declares war on Germany and Austria. Russia kind of looks at the situation and says, well, maybe we have a better bet if we join the Allies on the other side. And so Russia pulls out of their alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary and joins France and Great Britain and Italy. And on the other side, Turkey throws their hand in with Germany and Austria. So here you go, and you got World War I. And Germany attacks first, France responds, and the war is underway. Well, the United States is going to stay neutral. The United States at that time, their military activity was dealing with a Mexican bandit by the name of Pancho Villa, who was raiding into territory that belonged to the United States, which are now the states of New Mexico and Arizona, parts of Texas. And the U.S. Army, under the command of General John Pershing, was pursuing Pancho Villa. And so my father-in-law was in the Army at that time, back in 1914, and he was a machine gunner, which was a fairly new deadly weapon at that time. And they were pursuing Pancho Villa not only through Arizona and New Mexico, but in New Mexico itself. Woodrow Wilson wanted to keep the country out of the war. And when he ran for re-election in 1916, that was his big motto. He kept us out of war, because war was raging in Europe. The United States came very, very close to being drawn into the war earlier, with the sinking of some U.S. ships. Great Britain needed help, and sort of under the table, Wilson agreed to send supplies to Great Britain, military equipment and stuff like that, and Germany was aware of it. And one of the ships they sank was the Lusitania. And on the Lusitania were a number of American citizens that were drowned when the ship sank. And this drew America very, very closely into the war. Germany also tried to form an alliance with Mexico, feeling that if Mexico were in their alliance, they would serve as a counterbalance to keep the United States out of the war, because the U.S. and Mexican bandits are already battling in the Southwest. Now, Wilson did manage to keep us out of the war, but in 1916, just before the election, with the sinking of Lusitania, even though he was elected on a promise to keep us out, once he took office on March 4th back in those days, there wasn't a heck of a lot he could do to do it. Americans were up, they were angry. They were concerned about Germany gaining control over all of Europe. But with the sinking of Lusitania, there wasn't a heck of a lot Wilson could do to try and turn the tide of America, which was seething for war. So the U.S. got involved in World War I. And the first contingent of American troops under General John Pershing went from fighting bandits in the southwestern United States to going to Europe. And in Europe, because we shipped men over there, we were unable to You know, we didn't have any tanks or anything like that. So the Americans had to borrow tanks from the French. The Supreme Allied Commander was a man by the name of Marshal Foch, F-O-C-H, who was a French general. And at that time, when the Americans went into the war, it was pretty much at a stalemate. Neither side was making any progress. Most of the war was being fought in France and Belgium. And it was a standoff, pretty much. Germany was working on building up their air force, which would become very, very effective. And of course, one of the folk heroes of World War I was the Red Baron. As we know, the comic strip, Snoopy's always battling the Red Baron. Well, the Red Baron, and we'll talk about this some other time, it was very, very interesting about the air war in World War I. You know, they more or less, as the pilots flew around, they had a gunner, a guy sitting with a rifle, another cockpit, until the Germans finally were able to put a machine gun on the front of one of their planes and regulate it in such a way that it didn't shoot the propellers, the arms off their propellers when they fired. And again, we'll talk about that some other time. But Wilson got us into World War I, and the entry of the United States made a difference. It tipped the balance. That would eventually lead the Allies to a very, very hard-fought victory. And of course, we know that on November 11th, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th month, the armistice was signed, effectively ending combat in World War I. And it was called the Great War. It was called the War to End All Wars, but as you know, it planted the seeds of all the future wars that we've had since then. Wilson was very, very popular in Europe, but he was not very popular at home, and especially his second term. He pushed through a Democratic-controlled Congress, measures which the Supreme Court would later find unconstitutional. He reinvented the alien and sedition laws, which had been in existence under John Adams, meaning that if you criticized the president or you criticized the government, you went to jail. And these laws were pretty much enforced during World War I. If you dodged the draft, you went to jail. But in World War I, avoiding the draft wasn't such a big problem. There was such a war fever in this country that people signed up like crazy. And the United States had no problem recruiting enough troops and sending them to France. The problem that the U.S. had was getting tanks, getting planes into Europe. And as an aside, the Red Baron was eventually shot down over Belgium. And you say, well, who shot him down? Well, it was a pilot from Canada, Canadian pilot, shot him down. And he landed over Australian battle lines in Belgium. Well, he was killed in the crash, and the Australian military recognized him as a great combatant and a great hero. And he was buried with military honors given to him by the Australians and also the British troops that were there. And the Red Baron was buried in Belgium with very, very high military honors provided by enemy forces at that time. Well, 1918, Wilson's a hero in Europe, and he goes over to the peace conference at Versailles in Paris. He's welcomed with huge parades and huge celebrations and called the savior of liberty and all that. Here in the United States, once the war was over, the alien and sedition laws grated on the American public. And the Supreme Court declared them unconstitutional in 1919, and they were done away with. Also, Wilson went to Europe with what he called the 14 points of peace. And many of these were rejected by the negotiations at Versailles. Well, we are going to talk a little bit more about that the next time. In the meantime, summer's coming. Let's enjoy it. May Almighty God of His infinite wisdom continue to bless these United States of America. Have a great week. We'll see you all next week.